Hey, thanks for joining us for our Monday wrap-up. Yesterday, Jim talked about the life of Abraham, and the thing about Abraham's life that really gets me is, as it is shared, is the span of time that the Bible shares about Abraham. So we weren't able to talk about everything yesterday, for sure. But Abraham was 75. Abraham was 75 when God called him out of what is today modern-day Iraq and into the land of Canaan. But with that, we call Abraham the father of faith. And wasn't a perfect faith, but it was faith. And so what we have in the Bible is a great example from really the founder, or I don't like that terminology. Dadgummit. Don't want
Good.
So,
Dadgummit.
Yeah.
Dadgum.
so. Okay, here we go. Hey, thanks for joining us for our Monday wrap-up. I'm going to talk with Jim just a little bit about some of the stuff that was in his message yesterday, but a lot of it was not able to fit in because really when we look at the life of Abraham as it is shared in Genesis, there's just so much, and there is so much time. So we're going to kind of dive a little bit deeper, go into some areas of Abraham's life that weren't covered yesterday. In fact, one of the things that gets me is we call Abraham the father of faith.
Yeah.
And because he's the father of faith, we have an example of an incredible faith. It was not a perfect faith, but it was a faith that was grounded in the promise of God. And there wasn't a lot of certainty as he was walking and journeying with God. So let's talk Jim Beukelman for a moment.
Okay.
Let's talk you. When you think about the story of Abraham, you think about faith. You think about a guy that heard the voice of God and decided to leave his father's household and his country and his nation and follow God to the promised land. And even though he got to the promised land, the promise was not yet fulfilled. And in fact, he would probably, in a matter of speaking, never saw the promise other than Isaac. Let's talk Jim. How does the story of Abraham be the same, and how is it different if you're walking in the shoes of Abraham several thousand years ago?
So, I guess are we talking Jim Beukelman like right now?
Jim
Or
Beukelman, just period, yes.
Okay, so if God were to, the voice of God were to say, Jim, I want you to leave your country, and I want you to leave the people, like I said, that know your jokes, that know your culture, and I want you to just get up and go. I'm looking for some proof, right? There's a story of Gideon you talked about a few weeks back, we talked about a few weeks back in a Bible study I did that's talking about putting the fleece out, right, so that he can get proof that God is actually telling him to do what he's wanting him to do. I know when we moved out here to New Mexico, I knew early on that God was guiding me towards coming here. It was, 3.5 years ago. But there was a lot of me that fought.
Mm-hmm.
Even then, I went and I put my phone away. I went to a cabin in Oklahoma for 24 hours with no phone, no outside contact, no internet, nothing. Just me and my Bible and a fishing pole, trying to pray and discern the will of God, because I wanted more certainty. Because following the promises of God, it is great, but it's hard when you're talking about leaving everything that you know. So I think if I'm in Abraham's shoes, that I would hope that I would go, but his simple belief in getting up and walking, now we don't know how much he stressed or strained over that, is really impressive to me. I understand a little bit, because he didn't have any songs to listen to, right? He didn't have hymns to sing. He didn't have Bible verses to quote, right? He was just going, and he walked in that kind of a faith. And I don't know that I would be that bold that quickly.
I would echo that sentiment with Brandon Shaffer. I think I'm a guy that wants to have everything mapped out, so I probably would have had several questions as far as, how long is the trip, and all of those details in there, and so that does impress me, that just on the voice of God and the presence of God showing up and saying, "This is what I want you to do." Abraham went. Now, albeit it wasn't a perfect faith,
Right.
but now there was a part of this story that you didn't really get to go into, and when you think about the life of Abraham, everybody points to the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, and there's a lot of foreshadowing of the crucifixion and the life of Jesus there, and different things like that. We have the 3 days. We have Mount Moriah, which is actually Jerusalem. There's all those types of things that come into play, but God had promised that his promise would hinge on Isaac.
Yeah.
That's where God would begin to unfold the sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky. But then God all of a sudden one day says, "Okay, Abraham, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go and sacrifice your son." Now, typical preacher speak is, if God asked me to do that with my son or one of my sons, depending on the day, the answer is usually going to be no, and so on like that. But that's where we typically go. But I don't want to go there with that question here today. The very fact of the matter is, Abraham had been walking with God, and walking with God in glimpses of certainty, but mostly uncertainty, for 40 or 50 years. So how does the 40 or 50 years of walking with God play into Abraham's act of faith and obedience in getting the wood and taking his son and then journeying up the mountain, building the altar, and even going almost to the point of sacrificing his son? What is faith? What does longevity have to do with playing in how Abraham was able to do that?
Well, how much of that, that's a great question, because how much of that has to do with, you said the 40 or 50 years, but the multiple times that God had already appeared to him and then asked him to take these types of steps, right? I don't believe that if he had Isaac a year after God appeared to him the first time, and then God said, "Okay, now I want you to go sacrifice him." I don't know that Abraham would have done that. I think that this is built on top of answered promises already. Right? So what I mean by that is, the more that we walk with God, the easier it is oftentimes to be able to walk with God. Right? The more that we take these steps of faith when we don't know what the answer is going to be, each time that we do that, it makes it easier the next time to go ahead and keep going down that path again. We've actually, scientifically developed some neural pathways towards having more faith in him in that way. We're able to do these things. And I think for Abraham, who had now seen God say, "I'm going to give you a child," and waited for that, seen God say, I'm going to give you a land, and waited for that, now had a land and he had a child. He had seen God answer those promises and fulfill those things out. And we obviously get a glimpse of that in Hebrews 11, when the writer of Hebrews tells us that Abraham believed that God would in some way raise Isaac back to life if he sacrificed him. He believed God to the point where he thought, this is completely against the gut, but he'll bring him back to life because that promise is coming through this kid.
Right.
And that, I think more than anything else, is where the longer we walk in the faith, we don't necessarily always have to have an explanation for how it's going to work out. We just know that it is going to part.
Right.
And for me, that's something I really want to continue to grow in. Because like I said, like you were saying, I still want the how. I still want to know how this is going to work. If I'm going to sacrifice, if I'm going to make this sacrifice, not even a kid, I still want to know, I'm going to do this for you. Now, how are you going to use it?
Exactly.
Right. And his thing was because of the time and the distance that he had walked with God. It made keeping that promise easier to walking in that.
Very cool. So you mentioned in Genesis 15 in your message that God showed Abraham the stars in the sky, and it was just mere belief at that moment that God credited Abraham as righteous.
Yeah.
And so you said that is a turning point.
Mm-hmm.
How is the narrative that plays out with Isaac? And I remember watching a movie with in Abraham's life several years ago, where they actually portrayed Isaac as carrying the wood that he would that would be used to sacrifice him.
Yeah.
And we know that the journey was 3 days and so on like that. But how was this moment where God provided the sacrifice? Abraham said, Isaac said, where's the sacrifice? Here's the wood, but where's the sacrifice for the altar? And Abraham said, God will provide.
Yeah.
And there was the ram in the thicket, and God provided. How is this another turning point in Abraham's life where it says this right here, God is certainly going to keep his promise?
Okay, so I think, again, the way that Paul calls us back to it was credited to him as righteousness. That point right there really was a defining moment for Abraham to be able to. So when God shows up again and says, this time next year you're going to have a kid, Abraham's wife is laughing sarcastically because she doesn't see how it's going to happen. Abraham's not laughing. It seems that after God showed him the sand on the seashore and said, the stars in the sky, when God showed him the stars, he said, see all those stars up there? This is like the number of your children. I think for Abraham, that was a confirmation, a visual confirmation that changed his perspective. And again, that plays into, by the time they're going up for the sacrifice, and Abraham is saying, he's obviously praying, God will provide the sacrifice.
Right.
He's obviously trusting that God's going to do this. He's got this perspective now of God that is, in some ways, so exemplary for us. It's an example for us that is unlike anything that we've seen pretty much anywhere else in Scripture. Where He is willing to just walk away from everything. I think that right there. In the midst of that right there, as he is giving up his son, really is built on that picture of God is a father who is bigger than any of the possessions that I've ever had. I've given everything else up. I gave up for the most part, my family and my people, and He provided. I gave up all of this stuff, and God provided possessions. He's provided some home. He's provided the son. He's going to provide. And that, I think, the sacrifice of Isaac is a culmination of all of those other decisions.
Right.
In a way that, like I said, is rare throughout anywhere else in Scripture in the history of the world. Just such a poignant thing. And it ultimately, God knew what He was doing, like you said, because He pointed it towards the sacrifice He didn't make Abraham fulfill is the sacrifice that He ultimately gave up Himself.
Exactly.
One quick thing on that, by the way, that I think really fits with this. The culture that Abraham lived in, it wouldn't have been out of place for the gods to ask them to sacrifice their kids.
That's a good point.
Right? Every other person alive in that time was used to people being expected to sacrifice their children for their gods, which is horrible to us, right? God starts to do the same thing and then says, no, stop. And He provides the sacrifice instead. So whereas the rest of the culture, the rest of the world feels like they are obligated to have to give up these things to their gods in order to appease them, God says, I don't need to be appeased by your kid. I just wanted to see your faith.
Exactly.
Right? And so I think that's where God really showed Himself differently to Abraham, maybe than Abraham even understood up until that moment, was just how much God was different than these other gods.
Right. And that is actually a theme that plays out all the way through what we call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And in fact, much of the law that God instills is I want my people to be different than other people because I'm a different God.
Absolutely.
And that's really a kind of a cool thing. Now, one of the statements that you will hear at Valley View and have heard at Valley View is that God's not done. And I want to think about Abraham's life here for a moment, because when God shows up into Abraham's life, now we have to understand that prior to this, he was probably worshiping a pantheon of gods.
Yeah.
And God shows up and says, listen, this is what I want you to do because I'm the one true God. But Abraham is 75 years old. And at 75 years old, he does not have a child. The dreams of family, the dreams of grandkids, the dreams of all of this coming into play are now regrets.
Mm-hmm.
Now is the pain of my life.
Yeah.
And God shows up at 75 and says, I want to change the trajectory of your life. Now, I want to look at this from a practical standpoint. 75, having a child at 100, how is this a picture of God never being done with us?
So there's a small picture, big picture.
Okay.
Right? Small picture, God used Abraham, gave him a child well beyond childbearing years. God gave him energy to be able to raise this child, to be able to raise a family, to be able to do these things, to have strength to walk in this way, well beyond when he should have been able to do that. So that's the small picture thing, right? But even then, like you said, Abraham never saw, hundreds of grandkids or thousands of, great-great-great-grandkids. He didn't see those things play out. So God wasn't done, not only when Abraham did ultimately pass away without seeing those promises, God ultimately worked in a much bigger picture. God said this land is going to be your land early on, right, when Abraham was 75 years old. But it wasn't going to be for another 500 years that the people were even going to be on that land, right? They would be taken off to Egypt. They would go into slavery for 400 years. They would go through these things. There was all kinds of struggle that went into that before that part of the promise was even fulfilled. And so in our, for us, and I've thought about this personally, God plays, his promises have much more longevity than our lives, right? His promises are much bigger. His work is much bigger than what simply is happening in our lives right now. That doesn't always give us comfort, right? Because I want my problems taken care of right now. I want to see how this is going to play out. I struggle. What if God chooses to take me home to be with him? There is so much joy in that, but I still, in my flesh, have fear. I want to be able to see my kids grow up. I want to see my kids have their kids. I want to be able to do that. I would love to see the fruit of the faith that God has given me play out in the lives of my kids.
Right.
And I know people in the church are battling with the same thing.
Oh, I agree.
Right? But I think we have to trust that unless Jesus comes back beforehand, that the fruit of the work that we're doing right now may not be completely fulfilled for another 100 years. Right?
Exactly.
The work that you're doing right now in your kids may be borne out in your great-great-grandson, and you don't even know it right now. Right? That I think is an important thing that we see in the life of Abram, because ultimately the work that God did in that one little call in Genesis 12 wasn't going to be fulfilled, in a national sense until, you get into middle of Exodus, and it wasn't going to be fulfilled ultimately until Jesus came.
Right.
And all nations on earth will be blessed through you was going to come in Christ, and that was 2,000 years later.
Right.
The fruit of Abraham gave us Jesus, which saved us from our sin.
And that's still happening today.
And that, right.
And so when you're talking about that, I have to go to Gladiator because that's the best movie ever. But what we do in this life echoes into eternity. Mm-hmm. And Abraham really never saw the full picture of everything. And that's such a wonderful thing. In fact, I read a leadership book many years ago that was talking about how we need to create strategic plans into the future. and that there are companies in Japan that have 100-year plans. That these are plans that they will never see, but are carried in to the future. So we talk about God not being done, and I think God has a very good track record of saying, listen, I've got to work, and I'm going to complete my work, and you may never see it, but I think so many times we get to the point where we say, either I'm done with God, or we feel God is done with me. When in your life, so we're gonna dig a little deep, when in your life has been a time where you said, either I'm done, or I feel like God is done with me?
You know, there've been some personal times. You know, I when I was the last ministry I had there in a ministerial sense, I'd been in the church there 4 or 5 years, and there was a couple that left the church, and they came and they said, we're just leaving the church. It's not being fed,
I love that, by the way.
Yeah.
I don't.
Anyway, but this was a couple that had really invested into, and they left, and I found myself saying, God, look, I don't see how you're going to use me, because it doesn't seem like the work that I'm doing is having any fruit, and I'm not cut out for this. I don't have the family story for this. My background's not. I shouldn't be doing this in the first place. And I felt myself really questioning, whether God really had a purpose for me. I know, and I will say earlier on in life, there was when I got out of high school, I went to Bible college my freshman year of college, and then I left, and I went to New Mexico State. And when I got down there, I actually basically said, God, I'm done with you. And funny thing with that, though, I deliberately lived a life that was leading farther and farther away from God. But looking back, I can see how he was deliberately pursuing me as I was running further and further away. So to the point where I can see how God wasn't done, even though I was.
Right.
And I think there's that ebb and that flow, that feeling of God, I'm done, doesn't necessarily define the relationship. Right? It's not just a one-sided relationship.
Right.
It's not just us pursuing God and God not caring one way or the other, sitting off in the distance. And so there is no simple answer for has there ever been a time when you say, God, I'm either done with you or you're done with me? Because I don't think he's ever been done with me. Even that time when I felt like the ministry thing wasn't working out, that was a refining moment where in my life I was not necessarily just looking at Genesis 15, I am your great reward, God says. Instead, I was saying, I want this ministry to be my reward. And after I was able to sit back a little bit, God started to bless the church.
Right.
He started to bless me, but it took me, again, remembering he is the great reward, nothing else.
Right. And I think that's a great point when you brought up the fact that sometimes it's those moments of walking through either I'm done with God or I feel like God might be done with me. Those are the refining moments of life. And I'm going to put in a shameless plug right now. We're actually going to talk about that next Sunday, and I didn't intend for that to go that way. But hey, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to continuing this journey with you and hopping on Monday mornings and just diving into real life discussion. So we'll see you next week.